Namaste. So you were listening to The Silence of Being by Sherelle Hicks, and that's kind of the message that we're going to be continuing this morning. We're going to be cultivating silence. We're going to be looking at silence as a way of being, a way into being. You've probably heard the phrase that most of us are not human beings, we're human doings. We're always in a state of action, activity. We're getting lost in phenomena, getting lost in stuff out in the world, stuff in the head, and always kind of busying ourselves with things that take us out of the silence. And what's really fascinating to come to realize is that your truest nature rests in silence. It is the silence itself. And so how many of us are really familiar with the silence? And so over the centuries and millennia, there have been many different schools and traditions in the world that have looked at this situation and recognized that there must be ways to help those who are lost in the deserts and the dark forests of the world of confusion to come back to the silence. And so one really a potent way is to just pay attention to your breath. And when you're feeling your breath coming in and going out, right, there's that natural rhythm or current of breathing. At the very top of the inhale, there is a pause if you're sensitive and watchful. And then at the very bottom of the exhale, there's a pause. You're not inhaling, you're not exhaling. There is an in-between. And in the science of yoga, they call that in-between the shunya. 0 point is the way that we would translate that today. And 0 point, as you probably know, is kind of that quantum field where all potentiality resides. It's before things manifest, whatever they may be, mental phenomena, emotions, material phenomena. Everything is arising out of the quantum field. And in the ancient world, in these contemplative philosophies, they called the quantum field basically the void, or shunya. And so every moment we're actually touching into that oceanic potentiality. If we're paying attention, the breath will rise and we'll go back into the void. The breath will fall and we'll go back into the silence or the void. And so this void is also referred to as the Great Mother, the womb, the goddess. And so she gives birth to all of her children, all phenomena, stars, planets, and species. And so we are this offspring, and we are always connected to the Great Mother. And so when we are harried and taken away from the silence, we feel oftentimes isolated, lonely, stressed out, full of anxiety. And so these ancient sciences just say, come back to your breath for a moment with paying attention, recognize, become intimately associated with this ever-present breath. And another way that they had said to get into the silence by using your breath is recognize that when you're breathing in, there's a sibilant or an S sound. And when you're breathing out, there's an aspirate or H sound. And in Sanskrit, that they would put those two sounds together as soham. I am the soul, or I am he, I am God. So with each breath, and the yogis would say you're taking about 16,000 respirations a day, I think it is. And so you're constantly in this japa, or this meditation of saying soham. I am the soul. I am the eternal. And so one of the things that we have to recognize then is that we are always plugged in. We are always connected to the deeper, vaster self that gives rise to our temporary form. And we never cease being that deeper, vaster form or self. But when we get caught up in doing and we get completely isolated within our own separate self, And we also get caught into these language communities, as Wittgenstein would say. These language communities become their own worlds. And so now we have language and concepts that will oftentimes, especially in our staunchly materialistic age, hedge us off from coming back to this deeper self, this hidden reality, this breath. And so we're going to be going into this today as a way of, in one sense, deconstructing or undoing or dissolving these concepts and ideas that block us from this place of peace, this place of expansion, this place of deeper creativity and potentiality. And another way of recognizing that we are never isolated from it. So why don't we just pause for a moment, let all of that just kind of settle back down into the ground of silence. And Joe, if you would silence the CD now. Thank you. Just give yourself permission to relax. Even if your mind is racy and jumpy, just watch the raciness and the jumpiness. You don't have to change it. Just be with it. Just be with whatever's arising. If you're finding yourself impatient or frustrated, be with that. And like we were saying earlier, that when we come home to the silence, we come home to ourself. And so we're going to distinguish as we go into our conversation this morning between the self that we're used to being, which is kind of like a costume or a mask for our physical life, this ego self. But underneath and unbeknownst to this ego self that we are so in the habit of being is a deeper self, this pure awareness. And it's the one that is aware right now and confusing itself with the adjuncts of consciousness, with the phenomena of the mental, emotional, and physical worlds. This is the pure seer, the untainted awareness. And so we want to turn our attention onto this deeper I that abides in and as the silence. It is the undiscovered self. It is the kingdom of God. It is the source of all joy and happiness. Without knowing yourself, you cannot truly be happy. And so for the next 50 minutes or so, just be willing to give up playing the character of your ego and go on a journey, a voyage of discovery, where you're going to let go of all of these identifications and associations that are so familiar and so limiting, and come back to the silence. Come back to the witness. Come back to yourself. One of the great teachers of silence was Sri Ramana Maharshi. Many of you probably know of Sri Ramana. He was alive in South India up until 1950. And his awakening was quite dramatic when he was a young boy. And after several years of isolated meditation, word got out, the flower bloomed, and many bees began to buzz around Sri Ramana, searching for that nectar. And according to him, he actually preferred to teach in silence. He says, my teaching is silence. But for many minds that are addicted to language and concepts, they can't comprehend and process the pure teaching, which comes from the silence. And so I use words as a medicinal and provisional approach to the teaching until through the right use of words and concepts, we can finally let go and fall back into the peace of the heart. So it's that Advaita Vedanta image of the thorn that is used to pluck out the thorn that's in the finger. And then once you can pluck out the thorn that's been bothering you, you throw the other thorn away. It served its function. So too, language and concepts. They can get you to the door. They're like Buddha's finger pointing to the moon. But eventually there is the you that is beyond concepts, beyond language, the one listening right now, the one who's so addicted to seeking outside of itself that it has clothed itself in language and concepts and has forgotten itself as a result, is now identified with the temporary, the ephemeral, the perishable. And so this is why Sri Ramana would oftentimes just sit silently, and some would imbue that silence and allow it to melt all of these barriers and defenses that we have built up in our being. So if you find that's coming on for you this morning, and you find the sticky points and the constrictions, etc., coming up, relax into them, breathe into them, let go, feel the fluidity restoring you to this place where you can actually flow through those constrictions. They're very porous if we don't label them as blocks and obstacles. They actually become just, empty. But we have to recognize this deeper silence that we want and that will allow us to come home to the heart. And so what we're going to find as we go on this journey is there's a lot of parts of ourself, many parts of ourself, that are like these raging rivers and brooks and streams that are always in motion, always flowing, always, away from their source. But through this redirection of our attention and intention, these waters can come back into the sea of the heart. So wherever you find yourself, if you're in emotions and concepts and intellectualizing, these are parts of those disconnected rivers that need to just simply flow back into the silence of the heart. So that's you as the director of the current. You're going to redirect the currents of your thoughts, your emotions, and your mental or your physical or bodily sensations. Just allow them to flow back into the ocean of the heart. And before we really embark, I do want to mention something that Ramana is asked about, I think where many of us are or find ourselves often, and that is dealing with doubts. Like, is this to even be believed? Is this even possible? There's something in me maybe that's inclined towards it, attracted to it. But will this ever happen for me? Will I ever encounter this illuminated self that I hear so much about, this peace that passes all human understanding? Will I ever be able to undo the knots of my doubts? And so an individual came to Ramana and asked this question: what is that one thing knowing which all doubts are solved? The master's response is quite pithy. Know the doubter. Who's the one doubting? Turn your attention onto the one doubting. If the doubter be held, right, in awareness, the doubts will not arise. So you turn your attention onto the doubter. You examine the doubter. See, one of the things that we're going to recognize if we, get onto the path of self-examination and deeper contemplation, we'll realize this rather quickly, is that the ego mask that we're so used to being doesn't want to be found out. There is a very clever, ingenious defense system that the ego has set up within the mind so that it keeps you distracted away from looking at the root of where the ego arises from. And so when we have doubts, if you were to really examine first and foremost, doubts are a way of distracting us from looking at what would resolve our doubts. Doubts are excuses and delays and defenses from having to actually confront our own deeper nature. So when you're really set on waking up, this is what Ramana is basically getting at. You then don't pay attention to the material or the content that is causing you to doubt. You actually look at the one who's doubting. What's the agenda here? What's the payoff to doubting? And you examine that. You examine the nature of the doubter. And he says when you do that, you'll take your attention off of the stuff of doubts. You'll look directly at the doubter. Who's doubting? Who's confused? Here the doubter is transcendent, he says. Again, when the doubter ceases to exist, there will be no doubts arising. From where will they arise? All jnanis jivanmuktas. He says all are jnanis, jivanmuktas. Now, if you're not familiar with those terms in Sanskrit, a jnani is a knower of the absolute truth. A jivanmukta is one who is liberated in consciousness while still seemingly embodied. And what Ramana is saying is all are jnanis and jivanmuktas. All are the liberated self. There can't be other than the one reality. So when you examine the doubter, you'll come to realize you are the jnani. The doubt was just a costume, a disguise, a game of hide and seek that you were playing with yourself, is what he's getting at here. All are jnanis, jivanmuktas, only they are not aware of the fact. Doubts must be uprooted. This means that the doubter must be uprooted. Here, the doubter is the mind. So this teaching goes right to the heart of you as the being behind all doing, right? The silence. You are the silence in which everything else is arising, which means that there is only you in creation. And here you are in another form, talking to another form of you. When we begin to doubt the doubter, it also changes our focus, our perception. So we're no longer fragmenting our mind, we're harmonizing or unifying our awareness. And we begin to sense this deeper substratum or this deeper silence that is behind all the masks, all the forms. This is the kingdom of God, right? This is why Jesus says in the gospel, when your eye becomes single, when you're only looking for the one truth or the silence, your whole body will be filled with light. When your mind or your eye is not single, your body will be filled with darkness. And he says, how great is that darkness? Because when you're not seeing the one, you're lost in the forest of multiplicity, which is confusion. Right? So this is where you have to really be firm with yourself in the beginning. To get out of that forest, you have to say, okay, I'm no longer going to allow this toddler of my mind to run the show. The mind is very much like a toddler or an untrained dog. And if we just allow that untrained dog to run our life, it's going to make a mess of it. So you have to be very firm in the beginning especially, and all throughout until you come to that door, as we've been saying. So we'll pick up Ramana in just a moment. I do want to get into Rumi. Along these lines, he has some beautiful things to share with us this morning. And in this poem, it takes us back to the beginning of our meditation. The poem is Only Breath. Not Christian or Jew or Muslim, not Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi, or Zen, not any religion or cultural system. I am not from the East or the West, not out of the ocean or up from the ground, not natural or ethereal, not composed of elements at all. I do not exist. I am not an entity in this world or the next, did not descend from Adam or Eve or any origin story. My place is placeless, a trace of the traceless, neither body or soul. I belong to the beloved, have seen the two worlds as one, and that one call to and know, first, last, outer, inner, only that breath, breathing human being. So again, as Ramana, Rumi is taking us to a place where we are not lost in phenomena, in things in the ocean, things on the earth, things in heaven. We're not lost in origin stories or cultural systems, political ideologies, metaphysical myths. None of that exists in the reality of the self. And that self is literally breathing human being. It's the, as the Upanishads say, the breath behind your breath, the eye behind your eye, the mind behind your mind, the self behind yourself. So intimate that you are it already, so subtle that we are overlooking it. We're experiencing it every instant, and yet completely unaware of it. And it makes sense to see it this way. The reason why we're unaware of it, it's in my experience, is because when we are so hypnotized by the outer world and the things that we are chasing after, and the lower pleasure drives that we have and the fear drives that we're trying to avoid, we develop a coarseness within the mind. The mind becomes coarse and callous and obtuse, and it can't pick up the subtler, quieter frequencies of this deeper nature. That's why the breathing practice, the slowing down, the doing nothing, the opening and relaxing is so vital to coming home to yourself, because yourself is not a thing to be grasped. It's subtler than the subtlest. So only the quiet mind can remember God, as it says in A Course in Miracles. So like even now as we're having this conversation, it just felt so nice to connect with you and realize that there was another layer where we can drop the concepts of John speaking to people out there. This might sound weird to some of you, but there was another place that we just arrived at. Like again, Rumi has that beautiful poem, "There is a field beyond good and evil. I will meet you there." And it's back to the silence. This is where we actually can meet. This is where we can actually have relationship. Right? Remember what we said, if you don't know yourself, you'll misinterpret everything. So as long as we're just being the ego mask, we can't really be in real relationship. This idea of Narcissus keeps coming up in our conversations each week. Narcissus is the one who's in love with his or her self-image, the ego mask. And we have to turn our face away from our image and towards the imageless. We have to become acutely aware of the one who is breathing us. Another one from Rumi. When you are with everyone but me, you're with no one. When you are with no one but me, you are with everyone. Instead of being so bound up with everyone, be everyone. When you become that many, you're nothing, empty, silent. And maybe, it's arising for you where you sense this naturalness to this pointing out. It's natural, it's safe, it's comfortable, it's easy, it's available, it's you. How long have we been running away from this and haven't even known we were doing that? Distracting ourselves, punishing ourselves, avoiding ourselves, fighting ourselves. And Ramana was asked, can you do this all on your own? And he laughed. No, grace is necessary. You can only enter this through grace. And then finally here from Rumi. A thirsty fish. I don't get tired of you. Don't grow weary of being compassionate toward me. All this thirst equipment must surely be tired of me, the water jar, the water carrier. I have a thirsty fish in me that can never find enough of what it's thirsty for. Show me the way to the ocean. Break these half measures, these small containers, all this fantasy and grief. Let my house be drowned in the wave that rose last night out of the courtyard hidden in the center of my chest. Joseph fell like the moon into my well. The harvest I expected was washed away, but no matter. A fire has risen above my tombstone hat. I don't want learning or dignity or respectability. I want this music and this dawn and the warmth of your cheek against mine. The grief armies assemble, but I'm not going with them. This is how it always is when I finish a poem. A great silence overcomes me, and I wonder why I ever thought to use language. This is really the final one from Rumi. Quietness. Inside this new love, right, your relationship with grace, inside this new love, die. Your way begins on the other side. Become the sky. Take an axe to the prison wall. Escape. Walk out like someone suddenly born into color. Do it now. You're covered with thick cloud. Slide out the side. Die. And be quiet. Quietness is the surest sign that you've died. Your old life was a frantic running from silence. The speechless full moon comes out now. And maybe you're noticing as you become more acclimated to this deeper silence and this substratum of your higher or true self, things become more fluid. The polarities of good and evil, right and wrong, have and have not, attraction and aversion, love and hate, they begin to quiet. They're really not that important. And when you can really see this cacophony of plus and minus, have and have not, need and want, when you can really look at it, it was simply there to have you look away from yourself. That's why Buddha said in the first noble truth, life is unsatisfactory. And the reason why you're dissatisfied with life as we know it is because we have craving. We're craving to get the things that we want, and we're trying to avoid the things that we hate. And that's driving us mad. And it's anti-life. That the perfect embodiment, if you want to look at a cultural system of craving, is where we now are in our intellectual history. Consumer capitalism is literally the embodiment of greed. And it's killing the planet. It's fragmenting families. It's doing all of this because we think that we can control and get and dominate and manipulate our way into happiness. And we all bought into it. We all were born into it. And it's just a mirage, an illusion to take us away from ourselves. But we have to be firm. We have to recognize, not substitute it with another cultural system. It's not that. It's you have to realize that this is what it does when you're unhinged. That's why the next noble truth is, in order to really come out of the madness of craving, you have to stop. Be quiet. Shut up. It's so funny too, when we hear something like this, I do anyway, I still would fall back and oftentimes probably still do. Lisa would probably be shaking her head if she were here this morning, into still trying to come up with my own way of solving the problem without stopping. So for me, it's, sophisticated thinking, logic, intellectualizing, esoteric systems, something that will still keep me separate to try to solve the problem of being separate. That John will do this. John will still win. John will still get his way. And the noble truth of the Buddha says John needs to stop. John needs to go back into silence. John needs to shut up. And what's so beautiful about this, there's no loss, because when John shuts up, he actually finds that he can come back to the abundant ground of being and finally feel the rapturous fullness of what's always been here, what he's been wanting. And because of the feverish craving, looking everywhere but where it was to be found. in the natural rhythms, in the relationships, in bird song, in full moons, in ocean tides. You know, you hear this a lot. People that worked in Wall Street and really were running on that rat wheel, full speed, they stop. They get out. They go and buy farm country up north, and they start working the land. They come back to natural rhythms. They realize that the hecticness, the unnatural cravings were killing them. So this idea of stopping is so very important. Ending the conflict between the false ego, who wants to be you, and the real self that is truly you. And so this is A Course in Miracles, lesson 106. But you know what? Before we read this, just a quick word from Ramana, finishing here with his teaching before we get into the Course. Language is only a medium for communicating one's thoughts to another. It is called in only after thoughts arise. Other thoughts arise after the I thought arises. Right? I am John. Once I'm John, John has a plethora of thoughts about everything and everyone. Judgments and ideas and concepts and worldviews. But silence, all other thoughts arise after the I thought rises. The I thought is the root of all conversation. When one remains without thinking, one understands another by means of the universal language of silence. There is another language that human beings can access besides verbal language. And we will plug into a universal communication network that all life speaks. That's why you'll often hear, if you've ever looked into other mystical traditions like the Sufis and the Jewish Kabbalists, they know the language of the birds and the language of plants. King Solomon was famous for knowing the language of plants and minerals. In other words, they're tapped in to this language of silence that all living entities speak, because all living entities are the self in the silence. Not at the level of phenomena. That's where we get lost. Silence is ever speaking. It is a perennial flow of language. It is interrupted by speaking. These words obstruct that mute language. There is electricity flowing in a wire. With resistance to its passage, it glows as a lamp or revolves as a fan. In the wire, it remains as electric energy. Similarly also, silence is the eternal flow of language, obstructed by words. What one fails to know by conversation extending to several years can be known in a trice in silence or in front of silence. Silence is the highest and most effective form of language. Spoken by the guy who hasn't shut up for almost an hour. But remember that illustration that you find in Zen. Zen is like soap. So you put soap on dirt and grime, which is, you're putting grease on dirt and grime, and you're washing off both. Without the soap, you couldn't get the dirt and grime removed. So without language of this nature, we would be lost in the confusion, cacophony, and forest of our dualistic language. So we need concepts in language in order to come to the silence, as we keep repeating. So the Course has something interesting to say in lesson 106. The lesson is, let me be still and listen to the truth. And he says, if you will lay aside the ego's voice, however loudly it may seem to call, if you will not accept its petty gifts, which give you nothing that you really want, if you will listen with an open mind, which has not told you what salvation is, then you will hear the mighty voice of truth, quiet in power, strong in stillness, and completely certain in its messages. Listen and hear your Father speak to you through his appointed voice, which silences the thunder of the meaningless and shows the way to peace to those who cannot see. Be still today and listen to the truth. Be not deceived by voices of the dead, which tell you they have found the source of life and offer it to you for your belief. Attend them not, but listen to the truth. Rumi just mentioned that in the poem, that this group of misery makers would come around, and he literally had to say, no, these voices of the dead will speak of you as the past self in this moment. That's the dead. And many of us are still listening through the filter of our past learning, our past beliefs, and we're kind of evaluating everything we're hearing from our past to see if we want or believe or agree with the silence, what's taking us into the silence. So watch that. This is how you develop and mature spiritually. You begin to watch how you're deceiving yourself. It's not always comfortable. It's not even comfortable to be pointed out at right now, right? We get a little, because we don't realize that we are the self. Like this is something that takes a little while to accept, because we've been so identified as the littleness, as this little me, that when we're given a message like this, if it's not couched in, again, origin stories, creation myths, tribal deities, racial superiority or group superiority, where we can get lost in externals, we can identify with an ideology, we can avoid the direct and immediate confrontation, then we're good. Drive around, those churches are packed. But when you're being told that the kingdom of heaven is you, that thins out the crowd. It's like that story in John's Gospel where he feeds the 5,000. And they wanted to make him Messiah right there on the spot because their material needs were being met. They can get stuff from this guy. Why not make him king? And then he says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you'll have no life in you. That thinned out the crowd. Only the 12 remained after the 5,000 left. These are hard sayings. How can we deal with that? The point is, the hard saying is, you have to make it yours. You have to actually accept this as you. And like we were saying, the little ego is designed to fight this every step of the way. And it's fighting it in a voice that you've been so conditioned and hypnotized to think is your voice. It's you. I want these fantasies. So that's why it takes something. Right? The Buddha had to leave his palace. Jesus had to leave society the way he understood society. You go out from the norm. You go out from the conventional. And then you find that it was always with you the whole while. So these voices of the dead are still going to be screaming for your attention. Don't listen to them. Attend them not, but listen to the truth. Be not afraid today to circumvent the voices of the world. Walk lightly past their meaningless persuasion. Hear them not. Be still today and listen to the truth. Go past all things which do not speak of his grace, who holds your happiness within his hand, held out to welcome you in with love. Hear only him today, and do not wait to reach him longer. Hear one voice today. And so, like, even in a message like this, we can catch ourselves being completely focused and driven for the next thing that's going to come out of my mouth. And I can get caught in the unconscious pull of having to keep talking and giving and speaking. But if we're really doing the message today, we have to let it in, cultivate a modicum of introspection, self-reflection, and see if we can see ourselves differently, just for a moment maybe. What also can come up when you do this is a feeling of weakness, which is really just uncovering the hidden inferiority that the ego always has. The ego suppresses this inferiority with grandiosity and narcissism. But it's always insecure. That's why it's craving so much. It needs, doesn't have, it's not stable. And so some of the resistance comes with vulnerability. If you start to really look at yourself, you look at your ego, you feel vulnerable. A sign of weakness. Right? Voices of the dead. Remember the whole time, you are the self. That's not going to change. just a couple minutes, I want to share one more thing with you guys. So the call to return to your own heart, right, to the silence, is stronger than the pull to depart, to run away from yourself. But it speaks in a different way. The voice of the Holy Spirit does not command because it is incapable of arrogance. It does not demand because it does not seek control. It does not overcome because it does not attack. It merely reminds. You're the self. Come home. Stop this frantic pursuit to seek what can never be found. Come home. Have peace. Rest in your deeper nature and find that you have everything you need and want. Yet peace is stronger than war because it heals. War is division, not increase. No one gains from strife. What profiteth a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? This means that if he listens to the wrong voice, he has lost sight of his soul. He cannot lose it, but he can not know it. It is therefore lost to him until he chooses right. Every breath, you're going into the void. Every breath, you're reminding yourself unconsciously, I am the soul. But if our minds are turned away, we don't know it. We're lost. And we're lost in our thinking. And then finally here, the Holy Spirit is your guide in choosing. He is the part of your mind which always speaks for the right choice because he speaks for God. He is your remaining communication with God, which you can interrupt, but not destroy. We'll leave it there. Blue bag's going to go around. If anybody has any thoughts or questions that have come up during our talk, we'd love to hear from you. Joe has a microphone, so for the folks joining us on YouTube and Facebook, they can hear you. You would just wait for the mic. And those who are joining us via computer, we would invite you to give to the church, and we thank you for your contributions. Just click on the link below in the chat box, and thank you again for your generosity. Any thoughts? All right, let's bless the offering. We are very grateful for the gifts and the givers, and we ask that this be charged with the intention to bring light and peace to all hearts that it may touch in whatever form. And so it is. Amen. All right, ready to seal the deal? Can rise. And take those conscious breaths as you rest within the center of the heart, within that quiet place of the present moment, completely freed from the prison of dead ideas, open and receptive to grace. And with this grace comes the natural response of appreciation and gratitude. Because with grace, we know that the light of God surrounds us. The love of God enfolds us. The power of God protects us. And the presence of God watches over us. Wherever we are, God is. Amen. Beautiful day, everybody. Thank you. I am giving the 10:30 service, so if you are a glutton for this kind of a thing, join us for 10:30. Or join us for A Course in Miracles tomorrow night, 7:15 in the classroom. Peace.